Hi there and good morning from the historic Banff train station. This one dates back to 1910. It is a rainy day here in Banff, which is good news because we're scared of fires in this part of the world. And it's only going to rain a little bit, clear up, and we've been having a beautiful summer so far. So back on Canada Day, but a couple of weeks ago, I did a video about the history of Canada being born or how Canada survived as a country. And so on the back of that, some people have asked me if I could do a talk about this province, the province of Alberta. And I think it's a fair follow-up. So Alberta, of course, was created in 1905, named after the fourth daughter of Queen Victoria, who was married to the Governor General of Canada at that time. But of course, to climb into this history, we have to go way, way, way back. People have lived in this valley for probably 14,000 years. Of course, this is the land of the Stoney Nakoda people, Blackfoot First Nations, Cree, Dene, further north. So, of course, it is ancient indigenous land in this country, which must always not only be acknowledged, but celebrated. Now, all of this land, we're on the east slope of the Canadian Rockies here. So this is part of the Atlantic watershed, really the water that flows into the Hudson's Bay. Well, all of that, way back in 1670, was granted charter to the oldest incorporated business in North America, the Hudson's Bay Company, and it became known as Rupert's Land. Prince Rupert was the first sort of president of this company, this colonial company, which survived until basically now, and it seems to have gone under. It was the last surviving colonial enterprise in that global sense. So that was this land, and then further up to the north, the next watershed became the Northwest Territory, and that was, of course, the Northwest Company, which in the 1820s was fused with the Hudson's Bay Company. During that whole fur trade period, those companies really stopped settlement into the west. So it was the land of the fur trade. The Métis Nation was born on the prairies, but really there wasn't a migration. Then gradually, of course, as Canada was formed, and please reference the other video, 1867, really in response to the American purchase of Alaska, then this land was purchased for $1.5 million by the nascent Canadian government, 1869, and then by 1880, the Northwest Territory section, which is up towards Yukon, all of that was ceded by Britain to Canada. And so suddenly Canada had this massive Northwest territories. As the trains arrived, they arrived here in 1883. Fort Calgary's founded in 1875. These tiny little settlements, they start to populate the West. They also needed to police the West, and that was, of course, the Northwest Mounted Police, which become the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They become famous in the Gold Rush in the Yukon when they controlled the border. And apparently, on the Canadian side, during the Klondike Gold Rush, there were 5 murders, and they caught all 5 murderers, and that is why a Mountie always gets his man. Please let me note as well that the Northwest Mounted Police can be seen very much as a colonizing force by Indigenous peoples, and that is also worth acknowledging. So really, out of this massive Northwest Territories, the first area to be peeled off was not Alberta, Saskatchewan, but it was Yukon, 1898. Of course, Dawson City at that point was the largest city west of Winnipeg and north of Seattle on this continent. Then eventually, as the population grows, there were people advocating to make the whole Northwest Territory one big province. They were going to call it Buffalo. At that time, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier felt that that could challenge, of course, the voice or the power of Upper and Lower Canada, Ontario and Quebec, and decided to make smaller yet still massive provinces as the population grew. Now, the settlement in the West was interesting. You never had a Wild West like the United States. The Indigenous people were rounded up and put on reserved land. So this is Treaty 6, 7, and 8. And if it's not treaty land in this province, then it's national park. Obviously, Banff, the first national park in Canada, the birth of the Park Service. So gradually, as the population grew, they decided to carve out 2 provinces. However, they also added land. It was Kewatin Land, in fact, to Manitoba, to Ontario, to Quebec, that Ungava Bay in the far north. That's what expanded political jurisdictions within this country. Obviously, Newfoundland joins a lot later, but in 1905, it was decided that both Alberta and Saskatchewan had enough population to become self-governing provinces, or with government, with legislatures, with their own tax-raising abilities, really along the lines, not exactly the same thing, but along the lines of the other provinces, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec. And so they carved them out. Now, the province of Alberta at that time maybe had a population somewhere between 160,000 and 250,000 people. Saskatchewan probably had more people. Interestingly enough, Saskatchewan today is about 1.1, 1.2 million. But before 1929, it was a million people because, of course, it was really the powerful farmland. Alberta's boom happens quite a lot later with the oil industry, which is quite different. So much of this land was rangeland, but here in Banff, of course, it was tourism from the very beginning. So in 1905, our little town of Banff, about 9,000 people now, was the third largest community in Alberta. My great-grandparents homesteaded in southern Alberta. They paid the $10, and on two sides of my family, I had homesteaders, and they came here into the Northwest Territories. So Alberta was carved out. The capital was chosen to be Edmonton because it was roughly the middle. Now, the province of Alberta is twice the size of Germany, and 4 of its borders, I guess you could say, are totally arbitrary. There's one natural border, the Continental Divide with British Columbia. Saskatchewan's borders are all arbitrary, so it was literally carved out of the Northwest Territories. This happened again in 1999 when Nunavut was carved out of the Northwest Territories. Of course, Northwest Territories, the capital up there is Yellowknife. Fabulous place, by the way. Nunavut was handed back, governance was handed back to the Inuit people, which is a fabulous step towards reconciliation. And then this province began to boom for all sorts of reasons, but migration came from international sources, Europe, from the United States. They had some populist movements that started here, and as a surprise to many Albertans, the CCF, the signature for the CCF, or the signatories, were in Calgary in 1933. That became Canada's new Democratic Party, very much the reason why we have a public health care system and social welfare in this country. So that was born out in the prairies. So there's always been a bit of a populist movement politically in the west of Canada, but Alberta in every other way is statistically and fundamentally very much representative of the kind of broader Canadian experience. And so that is the birth of Alberta, and the government, of course, up in Edmonton, and then they promised that the first university would be south of the North Saskatchewan River, the idea being Calgary, but actually they just built it across the river in Old Strathcona. So that was a little bit of early tension, and that was that early role of boosterism, which is another really worthwhile discussion. So the Calgary Stampede, which is actually on right now, it'll have over 1 million people come through the gates, but boosterism was because they wanted immigration. You know, we were built on people coming in here. You had all natural wealth, but you didn't have a market to sell it to. So each city boosted itself, and that's why you've got historic rivalries between Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Regina, so forth. That's all the idea of bringing people in. Of course, in the 1970s, when OPEC was formed and oil was nationalized over in the Gulf, of course, that's when Alberta really starts to boom. So Calgary, 1988, was 647,000 people when they hosted the Olympics. Now Greater Calgary is about 1.5 million. Banff, however, is roughly the same population because we can't grow being in a national park. So that's the source of Alberta, and people can be proud Albertans and proud Canadians all at the same time. We can also acknowledge history in the most meaningful ways and work towards a more inclusive society here. But that's how it came about, and that's how it was born out of colonialism, and that's how this province and province beside us came about through the birth of Canada.